He is a rare breed of really strong in theory and in methodology. I know that I always learn things from reading his work and from talking to him, and I'm sure that you'll all do the same today. So I'll stop talking and I'll turn it over to Kyle.
Thank you for the very too generous introduction, I would say. I'm really excited to be here presenting some of my work with you. So I guess I can just share my screen maybe, eh? How's this? Wait, is this, am I audible to everybody as well? All right, I'm gonna pretend that that's a yes. Like I said, thanks for having me here today. It's really exciting to be presenting at IBS this afternoon, I guess now. So what I'm going to be presenting on today is interest, surrounds from my interest, which is in perception formation, as well as sort of other aspects of decision making. So a lot of my research has that has done some perception formation and stuff has been at the individual or meso level. I never get these levels right. And what I started getting more and more interested in was how like larger community contexts shape choice and perceptions and preferences. So make sure I get this all working out right. First, I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this project. It's Eric Baumer and Tom Loughran. They're both at Penn State University. And so I wanted to give this one some credit where it is rightly due. So, by the way, I don't mind if you guys just want to interrupt me throughout my presentation. If something comes up, there's a question, feel free just to chime in. I prefer more discussions than me presenting. I don't really like hearing myself talk. So feel free to chime in anytime. And so what I have sort of become more and more interested in over the last few years is offender decision making, as David said. So inevitably, I draw a little bit on rational choice theories. And in particular, rational choice theories, like if you want to do the weak form version of it, is just this idea that human beings, individuals are responsive to incentives, right? So we can do the carrot and the stick sort of thing and hopefully be able to nudge people into certain behavioral elements. Typically, I've been saying that our action choices are a function of two components. The expectations, what we think might happen, right? So in criminology and stuff, or just in general, we typically think of the risks associated with behavior, any potential costs, whether it's financial, as well as the rewards associated with crime. We'll talk a little more the specifics of what I'll be looking at today. And then sort of like loosely define the preferences that individuals have. The preferences can be hard to observe. I kind of loosely define it as the weight that individuals place on these things. So we all have preferences associated with risk. Some of us, for instance, might be risk tolerant and others are risk averse, right? So some of you may have been gambling on the NFL games yesterday. You typically be risk tolerant. Although rational choice theories sort of fall out of favor in some points, there has been some strong evidence that they are useful for explaining a wide range of collective action, social order, norms, family dynamics, things like that. And so one of the areas where rational choice sort of has been seen as having problems is with things like crime and deviance, right? Because we often like to think of crime, criminal activity as being heedless, it's spontaneous, it's irrational, we might think, which would be a big problem for rational choice theories. But there seems to be growing evidence that people are influenced by rational considerations, the anticipated rewards, costs, and risks associated with behavior. And so just sort of like some expectations that we might get that you might consider is perceived arrest risk, right? So if I offend, how likely is it that I'll be arrested for committing a crime? It's very, very rare for someone to commit a crime in the presence of a police officer, right? The risks are too high. We focus a lot on the informal social costs that might come from arrest. That could be something like, how likely is it that you'd be kicked out of school? How does it harm your job opportunities? Would your parents be disappointed in you, etc.? So that's kind of like on like the deterrent side of it, risk and social costs. And then we also, it turns out, not surprisingly, that rewards matter a lot. And so the kind of like the two big ones that we talk about are the social rewards from crime, and then the intrinsic thrills rush. Often we get clever in trying to explain criminal behavior, but it's fun to commit crime, right? It's exciting, it's thrilling. And so often it's just can be as simple as that. The preferences associated with criminal behavior that I focus on here in this talk today are going to be risk preferences. So individuals can be tolerant of risk, where increasing the risk of arrest by 10%, for instance, has little impact on their behavior. Or they could be risk averse and not like the noxious feeling that's associated with risk. There's cost preferences. Again, same sort of idea, ranges from cost tolerant to cost averse. We have preferences for social rewards. We're going to talk here later. People, again, vary on all this stuff. So some of us really care about what our friends think about us. And then one that's a little bit more tricky, and if you guys have any thoughts on this, I'd be happy to hear them, is sort of like the intrinsic reward preference. Like, how much do we care about the rush, the excitement, and the thrill associated with criminal behavior? So we have reason to think then that crime, which is supposedly like one more heedless behavior, is actually influenced by rational consideration, these incentives or disincentives associated with crime. So we can actually just write this out in a regression model, where we can actually think of these things as actually being the various components of this model, right? And so we could think of the observable risk, observable social cost, social rewards, and intrinsic rewards would line up nicely with these like sort of what I'll call the subjective expectations. Again, these are just like perceptions of anticipated outcomes, right? And then we can think of the weight that gets attached to them when people make choices as being sort of captured in these preferences, right? And so rational choice theories assume that on average, people hold preferences related to risk, cost, rewards. But we can actually hopefully see if people differ in their preferences for social rewards and their preferences for risk, which is something that I'm going to be interested in looking at today. Right? And so if we just want to write out a rational choice model of crime, you could just have a look at that. Now, research actually has been fairly strongly supportive of rational choice theories. It's been able to predict offending behavior of a wide range of individuals. So national samples predicts offending among drug users. It's a strong predictor of serious juvenile delinquency, which is the top this Lochran paper looked at. We also know that preferences and expectations jointly influence behavior. That should be somewhat obvious with the equation above, but essentially we've done some prior work that shows the people who commit the most crime are those who hold the lowest perceptions of arrest risk and are the most tolerant of that risk. And then we also know that expectations and preferences or a rational choice model can also explain a lot of the correlates of crime, things like gender differences in offending. We also see that it can help account for the decline in crime from adolescence to young adulthood. And so on the whole, the research tends to be supportive of some of the key predictions of rational choice theories. Okay, now what's interesting is rational choice in criminology and economics sort of like has focused a lot on these individual level like cost benefit calculi. But a key feature of sociological rational choice is the idea that it's inherently multi-level in focus. So Coleman gets credited with this. Merton brought it up years ago, so did Karl Popper. Coleman is sort of like gets the most credit for this for his recent work, where he invokes the idea of like a theoretical boat. So he says rational choice is an individual level theory of motivation that's well suited to solve what's called the macro-micro problem in sociology, where it's this idea that the predictors at the community level don't often translate to predicting individual behavior. A classic example of this is like collective efficacy. There's very little evidence that individual level collective efficacy helps explain individual crime. And so Coleman was invoking the idea of a theoretical boat that says, well, let's link structural characteristics to individual level predictors, right? And so here's sort of like his classic, I didn't draw this one, I drew the next one that's not as pretty. But sort of like this idea of social facts, institutions, structural characteristics, ultimately influence individual action, but it does so through individual level conditions and characteristics, right? And then Coleman sort of invokes the idea of the Lazar field type, where rates are just an aggregation of individual behavior. And so therefore these social institutions, structural characteristics, influence rates of behavior via their impact on individual predictors, okay? Now Matt Sueda, he has invoked a lot of Coleman stuff and said, well, we should apply this to criminal activity, drawing again on rational choice models. So the idea then is that a multi-level rational choice model of crime, given that in rational choice theories, they predict behaviors influenced by preferences and expectations, we should see selected structural characteristics influence people's expectations of the risk, costs, and rewards associated with crime, as well as their preferences associated with offending. I am not artistic, so I drew this. It's not very good, but this is sort of like what we're interested in predicting. We're going to focus on three sort of like structural factors that are often invoked for explaining criminal activity: concentrated disadvantage, neighborhood disorder, perceptions of neighborhood disorder, and perceived access to, I call it legitimate opportunities. This is perceived access to things like work and education, right? So then what I'm really gonna test in this paper is this first link here, right? How these structural characteristics influence perceptions of arrest risk, the anticipated informal social costs, social and intrinsic rewards, as well as people's tolerance for risks and costs and their preferences for the rewards as well. So sorry to disappoint, but I'm just testing this first link here in this presentation today. So why might we think that these structural factors influence these expectations and preferences? Well, there's a lot of rich history in sociology that would suggest that's the case, right? And so in terms of perception formation, we generally hold the belief that expectations are formed through what we call a process of communication and information, right? So this information can be both private, internal to us, as well as public information, right? So any sort of like signals, cues, etc., that might, for instance, lower perceptions of risk and costs, right? So we have some good evidence that to suggest that people do update their expectations in rational ways, right? Most of the research has focused on perceived arrest risk, right? And so to the extent that I commit crime and do not get arrested, I have a tendency to lower my perceptions of arrest risk in the future, right? If I do commit crime and I get busted, I tend to increase, right? So there's solid evidence out there for what we call Bayesian updating. Well, then we might expect certain structural characteristics to be associated with lower perceptions of arrest risk, right? And so there's some good evidence out there that at least for minor forms of crime, reporting is lower in areas characterized by concentrated disadvantage, right? Something like Scogan's work on disorder and cues, right? So if you have things like signs of social and physical disorder, you might hold the perception that you're unlikely to be arrested for engaging in crime when you do. Informal social costs, also might be influenced by the structural characteristics. This is a classic idea in the socialist organization school, where these structural breakdowns then basically lead to a breakdown in informal social control. So the perceived social costs might be different. And then as well as cultural elements of social control as well. So some of the Sampson and Bartouche stuff, looking at tolerance for crime in certain disadvantaged neighborhoods. We might expect anticipated social rewards to also vary across neighborhoods or communities. This is like a central idea in some of, what happened here? An idea that's present in a lot of a cultural criminology type stuff, some of like Anderson's work on the code of the streets, etc. And then greater exposure to the delinquent peers as well, right? That might reinforce the idea that crime is rewarded. And then we also are much less research on this, the relationship between intrinsic rewards and structural characteristics. Not nearly as much out there. There is some qualitative stuff done by Richard Wright and actually David Pyruse's old advisor, Scott Decker, on how structural characteristics sort of cause individuals to hold the perception that crime can actually be more exciting. Now so that was for expectations, and for, what's going on here? For the preferences, right? Remember, preferences, you can almost think of them as the weight that individuals place on these inputs when making choices, right? And preferences tend to be more idiosyncratic. They're less, quote unquote, grounded in reality in terms of signals and information. But we argue that they can influence, structural factors can influence preferences through what we call choice sets, right? And so this is classic research in econ, in legal markets and stuff, what's known as the legal reservation wage. And so if I have poor job prospects, I might accept a lower job at a lower pay simply because my choice sets are constrained, right? So we can argue similar things in communities that might make individuals more tolerant of both the risks and costs associated with crime. So Fagan's done some interesting work using what he calls the criminal reservation wage, right? That is, when opportunities are blocked in certain communities, people might become more tolerant of the risks and costs associated with crime, right? Some of Sullivan's stuff is essentially arguing that in some of these communities, getting arrested is just part of the going rate, right? Is part of life. And so we argue then that when individuals are experiencing structural disadvantage, they might be more risk tolerant, right? So a unit change, increasing their threats of arrest risk has a weaker effect on their behavior, and same thing with cost as well. And then we also predict the social psychic rewards also varies across labor. To get to this point, we draw on like some old criminology stuff. So Cohen's sort of idea of the middle class measuring rod, when he focused almost entirely on delinquent boys, argument being that when you've blocked opportunities, in his case for education, individuals start to value other things, right? They value things like social rewards associated with crime. Miller talked about how one of the defining features in some disadvantaged communities is like the desire for excitement and thrills, right? And so all these reasons that we might predict that preferences for risk, cost, and both the rewards might also vary based on some sort of characteristics. Okay. All right. So just sort of like what I'm predicting here, I'm summarizing my predictions here. So we expect concentrated disadvantage to be negatively related with perceived arrest risk and anticipated social costs. This means that they perceive their risk of arrest as lower as you have experiencing higher levels of concentrated disadvantage. Okay. And we predicted, drawing on some of Anderson's and the cultural sociology stuff, that anticipated social rewards would increase in areas characterized by higher levels of concentrated disadvantage. The same exact relation is what we expect for neighborhood disorder. Access to opportunities is actually higher values, mean that they have higher perceptions of access to legal work and to school. And so we would expect this sign to be flipped here, right? So more access to opportunities perceived, higher perceptions of arrest risk, higher perceptions of anticipated social costs, right? Again, keep in mind, right, this social costs are things like disappointing family, inability to attain a job as a consequence of arrest. So it logically makes sense that if opportunities are higher, people might anticipate the cost is higher as well. And then access opportunities negatively related to both the reward associated with crime. So for preferences, we predict the same sign always, right? A positive coefficient on risk tolerant would indicate that concentrated disadvantage, for instance, is associated with a greater tolerance for risk, right? In other words, their coefficient would be closer to 0, for instance, right? So the threat of arrest risk doesn't have a large impact on as large an impact on their behavior. We predict a similar thing for cost tolerance. And then for the social reward and intrinsic reward preferences, we also expect it to be positive. That would indicate that in areas with higher levels of concentrated disadvantage, social rewards have a larger impact on behavior. Okay? Again, same thing with neighborhood disorder, perceived neighborhood disorder, and for access to legitimate opportunities. Okay. So to test this, finding this data is not easy. It required some measures of concentrated disadvantage and also measures of our key rational choice inputs, right? And so the data that I used to analyze this comes from the Pathways to Desistance study. It started out with 1,354 juvenile offenders in Philadelphia and Phoenix areas. Our final sample was 92% of the respondents. It's 1,240 of them. We have over 7,000 observations and by n times t. Okay. So perhaps surprisingly, many of the sample, they come from a diverse range of neighborhoods. So our disadvantage score ranges from about -2 to +3. So concentrated disadvantage is a weighted factor score of 4 block group level characteristics. This will be things like percent of people in the block group living in poverty, percent of single parent households. This is the standard concentrated disadvantage score. So that's the first one. That's what we call the objective neighborhood measure. We also have perceived disorder. This is taken from the Sampson and Rodenbush physical and social disorder. So physical disorder is things like graffiti, needles on the ground, cigarette butts on the ground. And social disorder were things like, do you witness fights in your streets? Things like that. So it's 21 items. Higher levels reflect higher levels of perceived neighborhood disorder. And then the access to legitimate opportunities for success. This was 6 items that say things like, it's easy for people in my neighborhood to find stable employment. It's easy for people in my neighborhood to have success in school. Most people in my neighborhood will go to college, things like that. Okay. All right. I know there's a lot going on here at this point. Our expectation measures, we use 4. Perceived arrest risk is a mean of 7 items. Individuals are asked, if you committed a crime, how likely is it that you would be caught and arrested? In a range from no chance at all to absolutely certain to be caught. The informal social cost scale is a mean of, I believe, I didn't put it on there, 9 items, I think, how likely it is that if an individual was arrested, they would experience different types of social costs. So that their family would lose respect for them, it'd be harder to get a job. Again, this ranges from very unlikely to very likely. Anticipated social rewards is a mean of 15 items that captures social rewards from 3 crimes. It's like things like, if I steal something from a store, people my age will respect me. Or if I engage in armed robbery, people are more likely to respect me. The perceived intrinsic rewards is the mean of 7 items. It's the same 7 crimes in the perceived arrest risk score, where people are asked how much fun or kick they would get if they committed crimes, ranging from no fun at all to a great deal of fun or kick. Fun or kick. We control for several things in this paper. A lot of individual level characteristics that have been shown in the past to be related to perception formation and preferences. So we have age, gender, where we have males equal to 1, females not. It's about 83% male. We have race and ethnicity, parental SES, which is a social position index, household composition, is just how many people in their house, how many people live and reside in their house. We have a measure if their biological parents are married, impulse control, and then we have their total IQ score. If you want more information on some of this, I'd be happy to answer any questions. For space purposes and for being pleasing on the eyes, I just present in the results, I just present the main predictors, but I have the full table as you're interested. Okay, now we do not actually observe preferences, right? But instead what we do is we let their behavior reflect what their preferences are. Right?
Is that the same for choice sets? Sorry, there was a question from David Cook Martin on whether the choice sets you were discussing before were observable or unobservable.
What about the choice sets? I'm sorry. So we don't observe choice sets, right? We just have measures of their access to opportunities, which is the closest we'll get to that. But then we just have concentrated disadvantage in them. So are there any other questions before I proceed?
No, that's it, thanks.
Okay, so we estimate what's called a variation of what we're gonna call like a random utility model, right? So for the first 3 things listed here, we have multiple items per person for each crime, right? So we can essentially just use like a multi-level modeling framework and estimate a random coefficient. Right? Now, again, that random coefficient would represent the weight or the influence that these predictors have on an individual's behavior, right? And so if we have large negative thing on delta 1 here, okay, something else. Large negative values would indicate that the individual is highly deterrable. In other words, that increasing in risk is having a large influence on their behavior, okay? We have the same thing for the personal rewards. And for social rewards, we only have 3 crimes, right? And so we're getting a little stretched on the items. Now, so for the first 3, then we can, for each individual at each time point, we can estimate a random slope associated with the rational choice inputs, right? So again, large positive values here on personal rewards would indicate that the individual places a lot of weight on intrinsic rewards, right? For cost tolerance, we do not actually have multiple items differing across crime types like we do for everything else. So instead, what we just have is a general measure that says scale if you were arrested, doesn't specify crime types, right? And so for that reason, we don't actually get to have the slopes vary across time points as well. We just have them over the entire panel, okay? So once we estimate those, we can save these coefficients we can predict the coefficient for each individual at each time point, and then we can use those as our regression model, right? So what we estimate then for both our expectations and preferences, we estimate random effects models, right? And so for perceived arrest risk, perceived social cost, anticipated social rewards, that's just denoted here in this XIT. So at each time point, we predict individuals' perceptions of being arrested, their anticipated social costs, their anticipated social rewards, et cetera. Right? We do the same thing for the preferences, right? Where now what we estimate is the slope as an outcome model, right? So we save the slopes and then we use it as the outcome in our regressions. Because the preference estimates are essentially latent traits, we weight the regression by the precision of our estimate, right? So 1 over the variance for each observation. Okay. So gets to some results here. We end up showing, first, this model just includes concentrated disadvantage, not the subjective neighborhood measures. So you see concentrated disadvantage, high levels of concentrated disadvantage is associated with lower perceptions of arrest risk, right? So individuals residing in neighborhoods with high levels of concentrated disadvantage, their anticipated risk of arrest is lower. Same thing with social costs, right? So individuals residing in more disadvantaged neighborhoods have lower perceptions of anticipated social costs of crime. We also see that higher levels of concentrated disadvantage is associated with higher perceptions of social rewards. In other words, the more concentrated disadvantage they have, on average, we see them hold higher perceptions of the social reward associated with crime. This last column was kind of wonky. It was the opposite of the direction that we predicted. In other words, concentrated disadvantage is associated with lower perceived intrinsic rewards. What's kind of interesting is, and perhaps not surprising, once we control for the subjective neighborhood measures, the effect of concentrated disadvantage pretty much goes away across the board. And the one thing I want to point out is this is not like a multicollinearity thing. We'll talk about that in a minute. The standard errors don't change as much, right? But the coefficient essentially goes from minus 0.2 for perceived arrest risk to positive 0.007, right? And so this is the effects of concentrated disadvantage are getting eaten up entirely by perceptions of disorder and access to legitimate opportunities, for the most part. The one exception being informal social cost. So again, higher perceptions of neighborhood disorder, lower perceptions of arrest risk, okay? And higher perceptions of social rewards. Okay? And so our perceived neighborhood measures acts fairly consistent with what our predictions were. Right? The one that also comes out is you'll see access to legitimate opportunities. When there's more opportunities, people hold higher perceptions of informal social costs associated with crime. Right? So basically all of these things are, for the most part, at least in the expected direction. Now, when we look at preferences as our outcome, concentrated disadvantage is pretty much unrelated to most of them, the one exception being intrinsic reward preferences. So essentially the effect that concentrated disadvantage, our objective neighborhood measure has, is essentially 0 for 3 out of the 4 preferences we have. However, what we do see is that the subjective neighborhood measures are all in the expected direction. Right? So higher perceptions of neighborhood disorder, we tend to see greater tolerance for risk and social cost, informal social costs, as well as higher preferences for the social and intrinsic rewards. And then we see the exact opposite direction with access to legitimate opportunities, right? And so one way to think about this is when individuals perceive that they have more opportunities for school and education, or education and work, their tolerance for risk goes down, right? They're less tolerant of the risk associated with crime, and they're less tolerant with the cost associated with crime as well. So again, these neighborhood perceived measures at least act somewhat consistently. Now, does this mean that the last sort of like couple of slides we're kind of looking at well, once we account for these perceived neighborhood measures, the effect of concentrated disadvantage goes away. This does not mean that concentrated disadvantage does not matter, right? Rather, it seems to be an indirect effect for concentrated disadvantage. The correlation between concentrated disadvantage and neighborhood disorder is positive 0.56, and the correlation for concentrated disadvantage and access to legitimate opportunities is minus 0.38, right? So they're fairly collinear. And indeed, what you end up seeing is when we estimate an indirect effect, this is just using the Barron and Kenny approach, that we see that the concentrated disadvantage does matter. It operates through these perception things, right? So a fairly strong effect from perceived arrest risk and social costs. Okay. So, all right, so sort of just wrapping up the findings here is the idea of choice is present and prevalent, I should say, in many theories that invoking social order, including crime. However, skepticism still exists, right? And some of this is can be blamed on people's less than friendly writing. Becker, in his famous paper in 1968, said a good theory of crime can do away with any notion of structure and just focus on the economist's element of choice. So he was not pulling any punches. And in fact, though, what we end up seeing is a strict, almost exclusive emphasis on individuals' cost-benefit analysis. And we have not seen a lot on the structure. Sort of one of my, I think always kind of like a funny quote is James Dusenberry has the great line in terms of the distinction between economics and sociology approaches can be summarized by this caricature distinction that he made, where he says economics is all about how people make choices. Sociology is about why people don't have any choices to make. We argue that this distinction is both false and unnecessary, that choice and structure are highly compatible. So what we end up seeing, well, we found fairly strong evidence that certain structural characteristics are impacting expectations and preferences. And importantly, this was all when controlling for a lot of the individual level predictors that people typically attribute these things to. So impulsivity, IQ, things like that. There's been some debate in criminology over the last few years of whether or not these expectations are grounded in reality, right? Whether or not people are actually using information from the environment in their own experiences to update their expectations. And obviously this has a major implications, right? Because whether we like it or not, our criminal justice system is built around deterrence. And the foundation of it is the idea that if we can increase people's perceptions of arrest risk, we can deter crime, right? And so we want them to be grounded in reality. We want them to be malleable. If we can, we want to lie to them and make them think that they have a really high probability of being arrested, even if they don't in reality, right? We also found evidence that preferences were influenced by these things as well. And so the one thing though, like the caveat that we have is that our objective concentrated disadvantage measure seem to act pretty much exclusively through the subjective neighborhood measures, right? In other words, again, this does not downplay the importance of concentrated disadvantage to that. Instead, those things act as public signals to individuals that influence their perceptions, right? The preferences, we found some evidence of a contextual effect, but they appear to be less grounded in reality. And this is consistent with a lot of research that shows they're somewhat idiosyncratic and therefore less grounded in reality. So, all right, so what are the implications of this? Then I'll get out of your guys' hair. Almost most research that has focused on perception formation has focused on micro and meso level processes, right? So characteristics of the individual or characteristics of their peer group, right? So they kind of like more intimate interactions. There's one paper I think that has looked at risk perceptions in the past at the community level, but that's it. And what's even worse is research on preferences is almost entirely on individual characteristics, right? It focuses almost exclusively on things like impulsivity and self-control and IQ. But we have some indication at least here that these processes are influenced by structural features, the higher up, the sort of more macro level, if you will. So we're in the future, we have some ideas on exploring sort of these mediating processes more explicitly, right? So we all have a personal arrest signal, right? So it's our experience with arrest when we commit crime, right? Well, one of the ideas that we had here is that if people are less likely to report crime in certain communities, then their arrest signals should be less informative, right? And so we have some stuff that we can look at, as well as value orientations, which is sort of becoming more and more interesting to people. And then sort of like the kind of my soapbox conclusion here is we often think of like that Sampson quote at the start on my title slide, that we often think of like choice as being incompatible with structure for some reason. But as Sampson argued, they're not competing forces. They're complementary aspects of social action, and both are important. Right? And so that is all I have, I think. So if you have questions, feel free to ask away.
Hey, Kyle, it's Bill Woodward. Yeah, I just have a question about, in my prior job, we managed thousands of offenders, and we really assessed every one of those offenders when they went out in the community.
Yeah.
And generally in our assessments of those offenders, we looked at both risk and protective factors.
Yeah.
And we could actually subtract protective factors from risk factors. Help me put this in that context. What else should we have been doing with those offenders to manage them better in their communities?
Well, I think this is sort of like tying back into a philosophical idea that I've been embracing more and more, is that people are still choosing, right? So we can think of things that may affect risk perceptions more than other like characteristics, right? Like building a bush in a yard, having a police car present. And so on the one hand, you have the very complicated, I think, process of risk and protective factors. And I guess I'm coming at it from more of a, well, you can still also increase the perceived risk. You can increase their social costs as well, because you still have a choice here. That was a non-answer to your question of.
No, that's fine. And how then do you build in temperaments, let's say Myers-Briggs temperaments? Because we generally found in our offenders, if they choice sorted a temperament, and there are 4 of them, that the SP temperament really stood out as a temperament that seemed would influence, in your language, their preferences. I don't know how did you sort, or how do you think about that?
I mean, I guess my answer to that question would be that that we, in my view, if this approach I'm taking in terms of like a rational choice theory, then I would say yes, it's influencing their preferences, right? And so if you can manipulate their temperament in ways that make them risk averse, right, or not place a lot of weight on the social rewards, for instance, you should be able to appreciate influence behavior. And we have good reason to think this too, right? One of the things that we know is we're highly susceptible to peer influence in adolescence. And so like some of the stuff like Larry Steinberg's work, it finds that when we become adults, we're much less influenced by it, right? We don't care about our friends as much. And so if we are able to manipulate that aspect, it would still be entirely effective, I would say.
Thank you.
Jason Boardman's raising his hand.
Hi, Jason.
So going back in terms of theoretical origins and rooting this to, I mean, classical sociological literature. Let's invite Max Weber briefly into the room and talk about legitimacy. Dare I bring up the notion of legitimacy, and how does legitimacy in both just the one's relationship to the state, the community's relationship to the state, interacting with the community, traditional institutions like education. Now we have a criminal justice system in terms of a legitimate system, which clearly brings out what it means, what race means in the US in particular, what racialized experiences mean within particular communities, but it's all structured by legitimacy. And so to me, I'm sorry, I'm one of those knee-jerk reaction, rational choice people. I apologize.
No,
I'm one of those sociologists. How do you talk about a shared collective sense of legitimacy at the community level, where it's not just a rational choice? This is just what we do, and in part of it is this order that you're talking about is not something that actually is structuring what's rational to me or those around me. You're imposing this rationality on me with this incredibly biased structure that if I choose rationally, then I'm morally correct in your view, but everyone else I know, I'm crazy. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, A, where does Weber come into this in terms of that sort of like legitimacy, but B, more importantly, how does your approach think about individual race and the race of the community? And you have 4 minutes.
Well, okay, I'll do my best here, right? I think I have a couple comments on this. The first is, I do think that people often conflate rational choice theories with theories of severity and punishments, right? And I would argue, like, obviously Weber was big time into some rationality, rational choice. What I would say is, I would say that if you have illegitimate social structure and institutions, then I would predict a rational person would offend, is what I would think. And so I don't think that they're as opposing as sometimes we like to point out to be. And so we need to be legitimizing institutions. We need them to be averse to costs, right? If you're not buying into the social structure, this is the classic Hobbesian approach, right? So I would say that you need them to be tied into these. Now, I am admittedly have been focused on most of my career in this short one I have at the individual level stuff. And so I feel like I've only begun to actually start thinking about like these. So everything I was criticizing, people focusing narrowly on individual level stuff, I was criticizing myself there. And so I haven't thought about it as much yet, I would say. Anybody else have questions?
Kyle, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sure. So let me take Jason's line of questioning just a little bit further.
Cool.
I don't think I'm going to ask you to go far beyond your data, but let's see just how far you're willing to take it here. So we know that violence is increasing in the United States, and those increases are concentrated typically in urban areas. So places like Denver, Aurora are seeing, homicide rates essentially doubling almost.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be a pretty unnerving 2020. Could you talk in rational choice perspective, so you focus on these 3 sort of objective, subjective characteristics that are altering preferences or conditioning preferences and conditioning expectations. Mm-hmm. Then we have what appears to be a double whammy of a shock to the system with COVID and social unrest. how would you explain the rise in violence in a rational choice perspective? Is this all, are these preferences changing, or are these expectations changing, or some combination of the two?
That, again, so I'm not going to fall into the trap of stepping outside my data. I don't know. My suspicion is that it is mostly expectations, would be my suspicion. But I'm not sure. Actually, I have a paper idea related to that central issue that I have not looked at yet, so I don't feel comfortable. But I do think it is kind of interesting, right? Like, why did rational choice theories come back and take off again? It's because all the social conditions in the 1960s were fantastic, and crime rates were still skyrocketing, right? And so I'm not sure that necessarily some rational choices, there's sort of this irony here, right? Where it's like they came back into because they were explaining differences in crime trends over time. But now we don't like them.
Any other questions?
Well, I really appreciated the opportunity.
I did have one, Kyle, sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry, I just didn't want to interrupt others if they had them. So, sorry, I missed the slide where you had the description of your sample. So this question might be a little silly if the sample is, I mean, I remember you mentioned the name of the project and so on, but sorry, I got an urgent message I needed to attend to. But how does race enter into this in the sense that, for example, when you show the expectations of arrest related to something like concentrated disadvantage, for example, it struck me, and I'm not a criminologist, I'm not an expert on this, but it did strike me a little bit odd, or I thought, okay, how does this vary across groups? Because for people that live in concentrated in neighborhoods with higher concentrated disadvantage, and for example, African Americans, I would expect their expectations of being arrested to be higher, not lower, right?
So it's in this data, it's lower. Now, so there's a negative correlation between race and production. Now, one of the things that, and this is actually, I was talking to Christy about this when I interviewed here at CU. There's another set of questions in the pathways data that ask about perceptions of arrest risk to other people. Right. So the one I use, they ask about yourself. If you offended, how likely is it that you'd be arrested? Another measure you have, though, is you can compare across people who saying, well, what about other people? How likely is it? And I have not begun to look at that. I was kind of just curious, but I would not be at all surprised to see when you frame it that way, people who are like in disadvantaged groups being compared to other people, they have higher perceptions of arrest risk, right?
Right.
Would be something that you might see, but
right. Okay.
But it's a really good question.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the answer, not for the copy.
I had a question that I just put into the chat.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I think it's like a little, 1 second, I can put it into the chat. Kyle, I think it's great that you're emphasizing that rational choice theory can really bring in more macro level contexts, and that it's not just about agency, but that you have to capture structure and culture. But clearly public perceptions of rational choice theory haven't caught up with this view, right? And maybe part of it's the name, but do you have thoughts about how it's brought more mainstream, or how the image problem could be dealt with?
So this is a fantastic question, and I love talking about this, but the term rational is a loaded term, right? It's a very loaded term.
Choice.
And choice as well. Now, when all these models were coming out, these theories, right, they simplified it, right, for estimation purposes, right? They wanted to have a simple theory. I think we know in all the research on behavioral economics, stuff, that people aren't the homo economicus decision makers that we might frame them as at times. But I don't think most people hold that view, at least in people who do this area, that we're perfect utility maximizers. I think though too that going back to tie this back in, there's people who economists at times, when Gary Becker first came along, he was wording things very strongly. Like I said, right? He says a good theory of crime can do away with structure. Right? So he was very dismissive of it. And I think at times like there was a pushback, right? And that we ended up, not developing together, I think, as much as we otherwise should have. I think I suspect it's going to change because at least in crim, I review papers all the time now that are trying to do more across levels. But I think that people are a little bit more friendly to some of this stuff. But you're right though too, right? I think people confuse rational choice theory with deterrence theory, I think. And they see them as one and the same. And then we don't like the policy implications of, we use severe punishments, but they mean proportional punishments, right? But I think it's there a lot of this is loaded terms, I think, right? So rational choice, severity of punishments, these things doesn't make them all that appealing to a lot of people.
Thank you for this. This is very thought-provoking. I also wanted to see, do we have any students or postdocs on the meeting who have any questions? You don't have to, but you're very, very welcome to.
You're a postdoc now? Feel free, Jason, if no one else is.
Am I allowed to ask too?
Well, this will be the last question.
Going back,
I'm your witness.
I really liked your update to and comment on Coleman's figure, and there were two things that stood out to me, and I just want to know if these were intentional. And then I noticed there were big differences. One was in his upper left corner. He borrows heavily from a Durkheimian notion of a social fact, of a characteristic of social places. Yeah. And you don't use that language. And secondly, he had arrows, which I actually didn't really like, in terms of one causing the other. And your figure didn't have arrows. I don't know if that was intentional, saying these are associations. I'm just curious if you could comment on those two questions.
So to your first question about why did I use my language different than Coleman's, was simply to be consistent with rational choice terminology. Was more so. That was it. I didn't want to confuse people who were reading, basically. But I'm open to changing it too if you think it's a good idea. The arrows thing, that was not at all. You're giving me way too much credit. That was not at all intentional. It took me 60 minutes to build that, to draw that thing. And so I probably couldn't figure out how to add arrows to it, would be my guess. So I'm not that artistic.
Okay. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so I guess we should impromptu thank you all for coming, and it was 50 of us for most of the time. So I think that this is great. That I wish we could offer food to each of you in your homes, but that's very logistically impossible to do. So anyway, thanks very much for coming.